Dim the lights if you haven't already. Maybe turn on a small fan for that soft hum in the background. Something to settle the space around you. Let your shoulders drop. Unclench your jaw. Let's take a quiet journey tonight. Not through castles or ancient ruins, not through battlefields or markets, but through something harder to look at, harder to talk about, and far easier to ignore. This story is not about kings or queens. Not entirely, anyway. It's about bloodlines. Not the poetic kind, the real kind. Generational, inherited, tangled. Bloodlines that tried to preserve power, or had no other choice. And in trying to survive, some families folded in on themselves, again and again, until the walls came down, until the outside world found them and gasped, or looked away. Tonight's story is about inbreeding, its history, its hidden horrors, and the people whose lives were shaped by it. From the misty hollows of Kentucky to the lonely slopes of Nova Scotia, from sunburnt Australian scrublands to quiet corners of West Virginia, this isn't a tale spun from legend. It's a quiet truth, often ignored, sometimes ridiculed, rarely understood. But every name you'll hear tonight belonged to someone real. Someone who may have lived, suffered, and died without ever knowing why they were different, or what decisions made centuries ago had sealed their fate. So we won't sensationalize it. No creepy music, no shocking narration. Just the steady rhythm of facts and quiet reflection. Let's begin with a question you might not have asked yourself before. What happens to a family when it becomes its own island? Not metaphorically, literally. A valley so remote that roads didn't reach it until the 1960s. A mountain so rugged no one came in or out for generations. A family so isolated they thought a child speaking in grunts was just part of life. This kind of isolation isn't rare in history. And it doesn't just happen to people living in caves or cults. It happens when systems fail, when stigma drives people into hiding, when poverty keeps them there, and perhaps even more unsettling, it happens by design. Royal courts once carefully arranged marriages between cousins, aunts, nephews, to preserve the bloodline, to keep land, names, and power in the family. The result? Monarchs with famously protruding jaws, internal bleeding disorders, and cognitive disabilities that history glosses over with gold leaf portraits. But the consequences of inbreeding didn't stop at court banquets or secret weddings. They show up in DNA, in birth defects, in the soft moans of a child who can't speak, in the twisted logic of families who don't understand why their daughters give birth at 12, or why their sons never learn to read. This isn't a comfortable story, but it is one worth telling slowly, gently, because behind every strange headline or backwoods rumor is a person. A boy with mismatched eyes who's never seen a school. A girl who thinks sleeping next to a pig is normal. A woman who's never touched a toothbrush and still thinks of her father as her husband. Let me be clear, this story is not told to mock or judge. These people didn't ask for this. Most didn't even understand what had gone wrong. This story is about what happens when the outside world turns away, when governments stop checking, when neighbors grow silent, when help never comes. We'll begin with Appalachia, a region of thick fog, family loyalty, and winding dirt roads. There, in the hollows of eastern Kentucky, we'll meet a family that was born blue, literally, a community so genetically intertwined that skin turned the color of slate. From there, we'll visit the Whitakers of West Virginia, living in such isolation that most members of the family lost the ability to speak, or even focus their eyes forward, not from trauma or injury, but from the relentless repetition of genes looping back on themselves. Then, we cross the ocean to Australia, where government officials stumbled across a secret family so disturbing that entire courts had to be rewritten. And from there, we'll move north to Canada, where a clan on a wooded mountain revealed what happens when incest isn't just hidden. It's accepted. You'll hear names, real ones, and you'll hear pseudonyms too, used not to erase but to protect children who survived things they didn't have words for. Children who were told nothing was wrong until someone finally listened. You may feel moments of sorrow or unease. You may want to turn away. That's all right. This isn't a horror story with a twist ending. is a quiet unraveling, and tonight we'll walk through it together, step by careful step. You'll also learn the why, the science behind genetic bottlenecks, why first-cousin marriages might seem harmless in a generation or two, but can unravel completely by the fifth, why bloodlines collapse, and why silence magnifies the damage. As the fire crackles in the background and the hum of evening settles around you, let your mind wander into the hills and valleys of these families. Listen not with judgment, but with stillness, with understanding. Let the world slow down. And now, let's begin our story, with a man named Martin, a creek called Troublesome, and a child born the color of a bruise. The blue Fugates of Kentucky. In the early years of the 19th century, long before the invention of electric light or the rise of modern medicine, a man named Martin Fugate made his way through the shadowed hills of eastern Kentucky. He was not born there. In fact, few people really knew where he came from. What is recorded is that he was likely of French descent, an orphan looking for land, for quiet, for a place to disappear. And Troublesome Creek lived up to its name. The area surrounding the creek was wild and almost entirely unreachable. It was 1820. Roads were few. Most travel was done on foot and only in daylight. The region was draped in thick forests and mist, with mossy rocks and deep riverbeds that made navigation dangerous. The air smelled of wet leaves, coppery soil, and wood smoke from distant cabins. What few people lived there did so because they had to, or wanted to be forgotten. Martin was one of them. He built a home near the creek, where the mist curled around trees like smoke. And not long after arriving, he married a local woman named Elizabeth Smith, a quiet woman, born and raised in the hills, the kind of person who could name the type of tree by its bark and tell the hour by the way the sun filtered through the fog. They likely never imagined they would be remembered centuries later, but what they carried in their blood would echo through time. Martin and Elizabeth, by chance, shared something rare, a genetic recessive trait that would not become visible in them, but would quietly pass on to their children. This trait was called methemoglobinemia, a disorder that changes the way red blood cells carry oxygen. In ordinary cases, it remains dormant unless inherited from both parents. But in this case, two carriers unknowingly formed a perfect match. And nature does not always reward such symmetry. Their children, when born, did not cry any differently. They did not seem weaker, necessarily. But as they grew, it became impossible not to notice. Their skin wasn't pink or pale or peach. It was blue, not in the poetic sense, not from bruising or cold. Blue like slate or indigo, in the way veins appear beneath thin skin, but spread across the entire body. 4 of the 7 children had it. And while it didn't seem to harm them, the visual difference was startling. Locals whispered. In those days, medical science had not yet reached these hills. Many believed the blue children were cursed. Others said the family had married into something unholy. Some refused to trade goods with them. Others kept a polite distance. But there were few people to keep distance from. The Fugates, like their neighbors, were stuck in an isolated loop. Travel was dangerous. Supplies were limited. Marriages happened between those who were close, not emotionally, but geographically. And those nearest were, more often than not, kin. And so, in the generations that followed, the recessive gene found itself circling. Fugates married Combses, then Smiths, then back into the Fugate name. The creek did not allow much room to expand. Roads had not been paved. Doctors were hours away. And so the community grew, blue, quiet, forgotten. One can imagine a kitchen in the Fugate home. A low-ceilinged wooden cabin with soot-darkened beams and a dirt floor. A cast-iron stove hissing in the corner. Children with curious faces and blue-tinted hands helping to shell beans or grind cornmeal. To them, this was normal. Blue was the color of family. But as the 20th century approached, the world beyond Troublesome Creek began to change. Railroads snaked through Kentucky. Automobiles pushed the borders of wilderness. Electricity hummed into towns, and suddenly the remote became reachable. And with that came curiosity. In the 1960s, a hematologist named Dr. Madison Kawin heard rumors. Stories of a blue-skinned family living in the Kentucky backwoods. At first, it sounded like folklore, hillbilly myth, tall tale. But his medical instincts were piqued. He contacted a local nurse, Ruth Pendergrass, and together they decided to investigate. What they found was not myth. It was real, and quietly astonishing. They located several descendants of the original Fugates, siblings named Rachel and Patrick Ritchie, whose skin still bore that unmistakable hue. Blue but not sickly, bright-eyed but different. When blood was drawn, it appeared chocolate brown rather than red. Dr. Kawin discovered that these individuals lacked an enzyme called diapherase, needed to convert methemoglobin back into hemoglobin. Without this enzyme, oxygen struggled to bind efficiently to their blood, giving their skin the blue tone. But despite appearances, the condition was not fatal. With a simple medication, methylene blue, he was able to reverse the blue tint, at least temporarily. Still, the cause was clear. Generations of isolated inbreeding, unintentional but inevitable. In a place where outsiders rarely ventured, the gene had passed from mother to son, from cousin to cousin, again and again. But the Fugates were not alone. In fact, they were lucky. Their condition, while visible, did not prevent long life or general health. Some of them lived into their 80s. They farmed, they fished, they raised children, and slowly, as roads reached deeper into the hills, those children married beyond the ridgeline. The bloodlines thinned, the blue faded. One boy, Benjamin Stacy, born in 1975, was among the last known to carry the visible trait. As an infant, he frightened the doctors with his almost purple skin. But as he grew older, the color waned, only reappearing when he was cold or crying. He would go on to live a healthy life. His blue faded into history, but the name Fugate would stay, etched not in scandal but in scientific journals. A story passed down in medical lectures not as warning but as wonder. And yet, behind the wonder, lies the truth. These were people who lived entire lives misunderstood. A child may have looked in the mirror and wondered why he was different. A mother may have feared taking her son into town, lest he be stared at. And none of them ever asked to be part of medical history. They just wanted to survive, and love, and grow old in peace. Now, as you picture that quiet Kentucky home again, maybe lit by oil lamp, maybe echoing with the clatter of tin plates and the cluck of hens outside, remember that the strangest things are not always shameful. Sometimes, they are just the visible footprint of an invisible history. There is no horror here, no crime, only isolation, geography, and a twist of DNA. But not every story in this series will be so gentle. Next, we'll cross the border into West Virginia and meet a family whose isolation left not just a mark on their skin, but on their speech, their minds, and the very way they saw the world. The more Dr. Kawin and Nurse Pendergrass looked into the Fugates, the clearer it became that they weren't studying a rare anomaly. They were witnessing the result of generational isolation, written into skin. One story they often retold was of Luna Fugate, a descendant described in historical medical notes as blue all over. She was known by her neighbors as quiet, polite, hardworking. Her skin, so distinctly blue, became part of her identity. And yet no one in the Fugate family seemed ashamed. In fact, those who bore the color simply lived with it, never once imagining the level of medical fascination that would one day follow. To survive in Troublesome Creek, you had to be resilient. The terrain was unforgiving, and so was the weather. Rain turned paths into sucking mud. Snow closed in with silence. Heating came from chopped firewood, not from gas lines. Lanterns glowed on shelves, illuminating small wooden interiors, heavy with the scent of smoke, sweat, and boiled beans. Even for families without genetic conditions, the challenges were immense. For the Fugates, who stood out whether they wanted to or not, life demanded even more strength. But their community didn't treat them cruelly. There weren't witch hunts or violent outbursts, just the kind of quiet distance that comes from not understanding what you're seeing. Back then, medical ignorance bred superstition, but also a kind of practical indifference. If the Blue family worked, raised their children, and kept to themselves, then it was none of anyone's business. And so, The generations ticked by with no diagnosis, no intervention, no explanation, just repetition. A few visitors to the area wrote accounts of seeing strangely colored folk, working in fields or riding mules. But the Fugates didn't leave their home valley, and the outside world, for the most part, didn't come in. That changed slowly with the coming of infrastructure. Dusty tracks were flattened into roads, telegraph poles sprouted like skeletal trees, and trains began to moan in the distance. The isolation that had once preserved both the community and the gene was now cracking open. By the 1950s, teachers and county doctors began to take notice. And for the first time, someone asked a question that had never been asked aloud. What is this, really? The term methemoglobinemia hadn't even been spoken in that valley before. Yet it described, in clinical terms, the reality the Fugates had lived with for over a century. It's worth pausing here to explain it more clearly, because this story is as much about science as it is about people. In healthy blood, hemoglobin molecules carry oxygen. But in the Fugates' case, a mutation had elevated levels of methemoglobin, a form of hemoglobin that doesn't release oxygen efficiently to body tissues. This causes the blood to appear chocolate brown, and the skin, because of how light reflects off low-oxygen blood vessels, to appear blue. This condition, while rare, is typically benign in small doses. Many people may carry a single copy of the gene and never know. But in an isolated gene pool, carriers meet other carriers, and with each generation, the odds of two recessive genes combining grow. And that is exactly what had happened in Troublesome Creek. Dr. Kewin, intrigued and compassionate, didn't just observe, he intervened. He administered methylene blue, a dye that acts as a chemical electron donor and helps convert methemoglobin back into regular hemoglobin. Within minutes of treatment, a patient's skin would return to a more typical tone. The change was astonishing, but even more astonishing was the family's reaction. Most of them were not relieved, they were confused. To them, being blue was not a disorder. It was simply life, and while some welcomed the treatment, others declined it entirely. They weren't looking to be cured. They weren't sick. They just wanted to be left alone. The media, of course, didn't leave them alone. Once the story was picked up by local newspapers, it became a spectacle. Headlines called them the Blue People, the Indigo Family, or the bluest blood in America. Photographers made the long trek into the hollers to get grainy black and white shots of descendants with telltale lips and fingers. But none of that changed the daily rhythms of the people who lived there. A pot still simmered over fire. A mule was hitched and unharnessed again. Corn was dried. Rain was swept off porches. Children played near the creek, their laughter no different than any others. They may have been blue, but they were never broken. And in many ways, the story of the Fugates is not a tragedy. It's a tale of resilience, of a community that adapted even as the world began to catch up, of a genetic anomaly that became a way of life and eventually a subject of fascination. Today, the Fugate family has mostly dispersed. The gene, diluted through broader marriages, has mostly disappeared from expression. But its legacy remains. University labs still use the case to teach recessive inheritance. Documentaries retell the tale with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. Medical textbooks mention the Blue People of Kentucky as one of the most well-documented familial methemoglobinemia clusters in U.S. history. And in Troublesome Creek, the forest still hums. The water still runs dark between the stones. Most of the cabins are long gone, replaced by trailers or distant relatives' homes. But the land remembers what the Fugates endured without medication, without understanding, and often without support. Speaks not to their strangeness, but to their humanity. In another part of the world, with different lighting or language, they might have been revered as mystical. In another century, they might have been ostracized entirely. But in this thin sliver of Kentucky's past, they were just people trying to raise children, feed their families, and rest their tired feet at the end of a long day. Not all stories about inbreeding are so quiet. In fact, most are not. In many cases, the isolation that preserved genes didn't just lead to skin changes. It led to cognitive decay, to lost language, to broken moral structures. And the next story is one of those. We're headed just a few valleys over into West Virginia. There, in a town ironically named Odd, lives a family that stunned documentary crews, challenged the limits of science, and still, somehow, remains hidden in the very heart of modern America. But for now, take a breath. The fire's still glowing. Let the Fugates fade gently from view. Their story has been told. And if there is a lesson in it, it's this. Some families are remembered for their name, some for their wealth. The Fugates, they were remembered for their blood, for what it carried, and for how they lived with it every day with grace and quiet dignity. The Whitaker family of West Virginia. If you were to follow the Appalachian Ridge a few hours northeast of Troublesome Creek, past sagging barns and rust-red creeks, past signs for towns whose names have long outlived their population, you'd find yourself in Raleigh County, West Virginia. And tucked inside it lies a place called Odd. Odd lives up to its name, not because of its buildings, they're mostly trailers, rusting trucks, half-built sheds. Not because of its people, they're quiet, private, proud. But because here, in the fading seams of modern America, lives a family whose story would one day be whispered across documentaries and medical journals alike. The Whitakers. They are, perhaps, the most well-known modern example of generational inbreeding in the United States. But that wasn't always the case. For decades, they were just the family down the dirt road. They didn't ask for attention. They didn't go looking for it. In fact, they hid from it. And when you see what their lives have become, it's easy to understand why. The origins of the Whitaker family begin, like many Appalachian tales, with twins. Two identical twin brothers settled in the area generations ago, building homesteads close enough to toss a stone between. Their children intermarried. So did their grandchildren. Over time, the once ordinary family tree became circular, looping tighter with each union. This wasn't royal strategy. This wasn't genetic engineering. This was simply proximity, poverty, and eventually habit. As the world outside evolved, airports, broadband, cable news, some corners of Appalachia stayed locked in time. And in that stillness, the Whitaker family remained. When documentarian Mark Lyda first approached the town of Odd in 2004, he'd already spent years capturing poverty, addiction, and social decline across rural America. But the warnings he received on the way into town were different. "Don't go down that road," one local told him. "They don't take kindly to strangers." And they didn't. When Lyda approached the property, just a crumbling house with patchwork windows and an overgrown yard, he was met not by words, but by a shotgun. A neighbor stepped out from the trees, eyes hard, barrel forward, letting him know that privacy was not a suggestion. But after tense conversations and tentative permission, Lyda was allowed to return. With caution, with a camera, and what he captured was not fiction. The Whitaker home looked more like an abandoned set than a place where people lived. Rusted appliances littered the porch. Trash cans overflowed. Broken furniture leaned against walls patched with particle board. The air hung heavy with smoke, rot, and the faint metallic tang of decay. Inside, it was worse, but the house was not empty. The family members, many of them adults in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, were present. But different. One man could not speak. When asked a question, he would grunt loudly, wordless, guttural. He'd then smile, almost proudly, and scurry off. Another would scream mid-sentence, pull down his pants, then bolt through the doorway, laughing to himself. Eyes didn't track. Sentences didn't form. Logic didn't live here. And yet, these were not animals. These were people shaped by circumstance, not cruelty. Molded not by malevolence, but by a long, slow forgetting. Lyda tried to ask simple questions. Where are your parents? When were you born? Most received blank stares in return. One woman mumbled names, some real, some invented. Dates meant nothing. Time didn't stretch forward here, curled around itself. So what had happened? According to geneticists and social workers who later reviewed the footage, the Whitakers were suffering the effects of severe genetic inbreeding over multiple generations. Recessive genes that normally have no effect had, over time, met their match again and again. The result: cognitive decline, physical deformities, and social regression so intense it bordered on feral. But none of it was malicious. There was no cult, no abuse ring, just decades of isolation, poverty, and a slow erosion of options. To understand the Whitakers, you have to understand Appalachia. This is a region that has been forgotten by almost every major institution. Coal mines dried up, jobs left, schools closed. Medical access, if it exists, is a county over and a paycheck away. In communities like Odd, people rely on each other. And when the world outside is too far to reach, they rely on family. The trouble begins when family becomes the only option. Each generation tightens the gene pool. Each new child inherits not just eye color or hair texture, but also genetic vulnerabilities. And when two recessive genes meet, both mutated in the same way, they don't cancel out. They magnify. In the Whitakers' case, this meant several members born with severe intellectual disabilities. Some couldn't speak. Others displayed strabismus, a condition where the eyes do not align. Many had poor motor control, jerky movements, unsteady hands. Hygiene was minimal. Education was non-existent. Yet in all of this, there was still something deeply human. When Lyda handed them food, they smiled. When he complimented them, they beamed. They posed for photos. They laughed. They held hands. They were not dangerous. They were not evil. They were simply left behind. Left behind by progress, by government, by access. The Whitakers' home remained largely without plumbing or heat for years. They scavenged, traded, and relied on distant relatives to survive. And though some in the nearby towns whispered about the blue-eyed ghosts or the ones who grunt, no one stepped in. It's not that no one cared. It's that no one knew what to do. Social services in the past had tried to intervene, but without hard evidence of abuse or crime, their hands were tied. Poverty, after all, is not illegal. And strangeness? That's not enough. It wasn't until Lyda's documentary aired that wider attention found them. And with it came donations, offers of help, and eventually modest improvements. A refrigerator was bought. So was a bed with a box spring. One family member even received medical evaluations, confirming the long-suspected inbreeding damage. Still, change came slowly. Even today, many of the Whitakers still live in or near Odd. Still walk the same dirt roads. Still grunt when they're happy. Still gaze in opposite directions when spoken to. The world, in many ways, moved on without them. But the fault doesn't lie with the Whitakers. They are the end result of a systemic collapse, where isolation meets poverty, where geography meets silence, and perhaps most tragically, where help arrives decades too late. Their story is difficult to tell, not because of shock, but because it challenges our comfort. It asks, quietly, what does a society owe to its forgotten corners? How long can a community live this way before someone notices? And what do we do once we see? Tonight, we do what most never have. We remember them. Without mockery, without spectacle. We remember that these weren't monsters. They were descendants of brothers, of parents, of families doing the best they could with the hand they were dealt. In another world, maybe they'd have been farmers, teachers, artists. In this one, they became shadows at the edge of town. Faces that turned away when headlights approached. But now they're seen. And once seen, they cannot be unseen. Their story is not over. But it is part of our history. Part of a long line of communities where bloodlines folded in on themselves, not out of desire, but out of lack. And next, we'll cross the ocean, to a place where that folding wasn't accidental but cultivated. A family so disturbing, so far gone, that entire courts were shaken by what they found. The Colt clan of Australia. But before we leave the hills of West Virginia, pause for a moment. Picture the house. Picture the laughter of a man who can't speak. The grunt that replaces a hello. The smile that lingers anyway. This too is history. Strange, quiet, real. The town of Odd may sit in the present day, with paved roads and satellite dishes, but in many ways it still echoes with the past, especially for families like the Whitakers. The family itself, at least those who remain alive and in the public's eye, no longer live in complete obscurity. Since Mark Lyda's documentation, They've been mentioned in think pieces, podcasts, and scattered across social media. But none of that attention has truly changed their world. They still sleep in the same home, now with a refrigerator humming gently in one corner, and the same collection of objects: old license plates, dented furniture, worn-out boots, piled in their yard. Occasionally, someone drops by with donations, or a kind stranger offers groceries. And while those gestures are kind, they don't reverse the deeper truth. This is not just a story about a family. It's about what happens when entire regions are cut off, left out, and ultimately left behind. Let's return to that genetic foundation for a moment. Because the Whitaker story, as heartbreaking as it is also a case study in how genes behave when allowed to recycle within a closed loop. Medical professionals refer to it as consanguinity, the scientific term for the marriage or reproduction between close relatives. In places where such patterns are common over multiple generations, something called homozygosity increases. Simply put, the chance that both parents carry the same rare recessive gene rises dramatically. These recessive traits, mostly harmless in the broader population, become dominant in a closed gene pool. Over time, this leads to an increased risk of congenital malformations, developmental disabilities, and even reduced fertility. In the Whitakers' case, multiple signs emerged: cognitive impairment, to the point where communication was limited or nonverbal; physical anomalies like facial asymmetry, misaligned eyes, and uncoordinated movements; developmental stagnation, where members remained at the emotional level of toddlers despite aging into adulthood. These are not cinematic symptoms. They are subtle, quiet, often mistaken for behavioral quirks, or worse, blamed on poor parenting. But they are genetic in origin and preventable, if only the right resources, education, and medical support had been made available. But in rural Appalachia, that kind of access is not a guarantee. It's important to understand the broader cultural context, too. Many Appalachian families take great pride in self-reliance. There's a deeply rooted mistrust of government, of institutions, of outsiders telling them how to live. That cultural barrier, when combined with geographic remoteness and intergenerational poverty, creates an environment where things can go unnoticed for years, even decades. The Whitakers were not an anomaly in their region. Others, too, lived in similar conditions, though not always with the same genetic consequences. Some families simply scraped by with low wages, no plumbing, and a diet of canned beans and lard. Others homeschooled their children, or didn't send them to school at all, either out of suspicion or inability to travel the distance. When you zoom out far enough, you begin to see how systems fail entire communities, not just individuals. One particularly haunting element in the Whitaker story is the lack of language. For many of us, language is the connective tissue of thought. It shapes memory, reflection, and identity. To lose it or never develop it means to experience the world in fragments. Sounds instead of sentences, gestures instead of meaning. One of the Whitaker men, often called Raymond, though it's unclear if that is his actual name, became a kind of tragic symbol for this. He grunted, barked, and pointed, but never formed a full word. And yet, when music was played, or a familiar face appeared, he would light up. He would smile. His laughter came from a place deeper than language. What does it mean to live without words? To never speak a full thought, to never read a book, to never ask a question out loud. This is not science fiction. This is the real cost of generational inbreeding compounded by neglect and abandonment. Not a single catastrophic event, but a slow layering of lost opportunity. And the deepest tragedy is that those affected don't even know what they're missing. They cannot articulate sorrow because they have no words for it. They cannot explain fear, or confusion, or hope, but their faces show it all the same. Many viewers who watched the documentary were unsettled, not by cruelty or violence, but by the profound silence that seemed to hover in the Whitaker home. The camera would pan across faces, some smiling, some blank, some twitching slightly as they tried to form a response. But more often than not, the answer came as a grunt, a nod, a shrug. There's no evil in that house, no sinister plan, just the result of a long line of people marrying within a 5-mile radius, because the roads beyond were too steep, too dangerous, or too foreign to travel. If there is one moment that seemed to break through the silence, it was when one of the older women, possibly named Laureen, though names shift in this story like smoke, gently brushed her brother's shoulder. He had become agitated, pacing, grunting louder, his face contorted in confusion. She didn't say a word. She just reached out and stroked his shoulder. His breathing slowed, his eyes closed. For a moment, they stood there, two siblings, blue-eyed, gray-haired, side by side, communicating something deeper than language ever could. That moment, brief as it was, reminded the world of something critical. The Whitakers are not a horror story. They are a human story, and humanity persists even in the most fragile of circumstances. Since their exposure to the public eye, the family has received aid, not just monetary but also medical attention, and the slow reintroduction of some support systems. But progress is glacial. Many members of the family are past the point where therapy or intervention would dramatically change their abilities. What can change, however, is how we respond to families like theirs in the future. In genetics, the concept of founder effect explains what happens when a small group with limited diversity expands in isolation. Over time, rare genes become common, and the population drifts genetically far from the broader species. It's been used to study isolated island communities, endangered animal populations, and families like the Whitakers. But the story is not just about genes. It's about access, awareness, outreach. Had the family been educated on the risks of close relative reproduction, had transportation been more available, had doctors visited earlier, perhaps the pattern would have stopped before it became unbreakable. It's hard not to ask, what if? What if someone had intervened 2 generations ago? What if one of the daughters had married outside the valley? What if public education had reached them? What if poverty hadn't silenced their future? But what ifs are ghosts. They haunt. They don't heal. What matters now is that their story has been told. Gently, respectfully, and clearly. And that others, like them, might receive help before it's too late. Before their eyes begin to drift apart. Before their voices are replaced by grunts. Before they, too, become a footnote in a documentary. The Whitaker family will never know how much they've taught the world. They didn't ask to be teachers, or case studies, or symbols. They just wanted to live, and eat, and sleep, and be left alone. Now we leave Odd behind slowly. The house remains behind us. The dirt path curves gently under the weight of time. Evening settles again across the hills. But the lesson remains. When isolation becomes normal, and silence becomes generational, strange things happen. And sometimes those strange things wear human faces. The Colt clan of Australia. Across the world from Appalachia, far beyond the hollows and creeks, lies a land shaped not by forests, but by dust. Dry winds, parched hills, and sun-bleached fields stretch across New South Wales, Australia. And buried deep within this expanse, surrounded by little more than scrub brush and silence, investigators stumbled on something so profoundly disturbing that even seasoned police and social workers could scarcely believe it. They called them the Colt clan. That name wasn't the family's real one. It was a pseudonym, chosen by the Australian courts to protect the identities of the children involved. But the horrors were not hidden by that name. They merely sat underneath it like rot beneath peeling paint. This wasn't a case of a single cousin marriage, or even a single generation of isolation. This was something else entirely, a system cultivated in secrecy, protected by distance, and repeated until the very concept of normalcy collapsed. The first records of the family trace back to a woman named June, born in New Zealand in 1948. Her story alone could fill volumes. June was reportedly the product of an incestuous relationship between her own brother and sister. From the very beginning, her existence was tangled. And when she later married a man named Tim Colt and had 7 children, the cycle began again. They moved to Australia and vanished into the countryside. There, in makeshift dwellings, caravans, shacks, patched-together tents, they laid the foundation for a life far removed from the world's eyes. And with no one watching, the rules changed. Brothers had children with sisters, fathers with daughters, uncles with nieces, cousins with cousins. And the children born from these unions, they were victims of biology, of secrecy, of neglect so profound it seemed almost fictional. It wasn't until 2012 that authorities truly grasped what was happening. It started quietly, as these stories often do. Welfare officers received reports of children not attending school, of a property where things didn't feel right. Officers were dispatched to investigate. What they found would shake the nation. The cult family camp was located near Baroa, a remote area not far from the Blue Mountains. But distance here wasn't measured in miles. It was measured in generations of isolation. The property itself was a scattering of rusted trailers, sagging tents, and small wooden structures that looked more like animal pens than homes. There was no electricity, no toilets, and little evidence of hygiene. Rotten food was strewn about. Mattresses were soiled and torn. Children ran barefoot through debris. Some had never held a toothbrush. Others didn't know how to use toilet paper. One investigator later described it as a scene from a third-world slum. Except this was Australia. Inside the tents, children huddled together. Dirty, hungry, many with visible deformities. Elongated faces, misaligned eyes, twisted limbs. Others had trouble walking. Some could not speak at all. When asked simple questions like their names or ages, many could not answer. Some whispered, some simply stared. Others grunted, mimicking the family's dogs. One child, a girl around 9 years old, pointed at her uncle and said, "That's my dad." Another described being tied to a tree and assaulted by her brothers. Several boys confessed to torturing animals for fun, not out of cruelty, but because they had never been taught another way to behave. At first, authorities struggled to understand what they were witnessing. Was this a single abusive household? A fringe cult? A drug den? The truth emerged slowly, horrifyingly. This was the result of 5 generations of incest. 5. What began with June's birth had spiraled into a complex, tangled lineage. The children's family tree was more a circle than a branch, repeating names, faces, and bloodlines until even the children themselves couldn't explain how they were related. Genetic testing confirmed the nightmare. At least 11 of the 12 children removed from the property were the product of incestuous relationships, some between siblings, some between parents and children. Many of the children had profound cognitive disabilities. Some had never used full sentences. They communicated in half-formed thoughts, mimicked speech, or made animal sounds. Their understanding of the outside world was nearly non-existent. They had never watched television, never been to a school. Some didn't even know Australia was a country. These children weren't just neglected, they had been erased from modern society. And yet, what made the case so particularly disturbing was the degree of normalization. The adults in the family did not see their behavior as wrong. Some even justified it when interviewed. One woman, Betty Colt, had at least 12 children with her full brother, Charlie. When questioned, she offered no signs of remorse. Her son Bobby's paternity was so twisted that DNA testing could not even determine if his father was his own grandfather or uncle. This was not hidden abuse, it was a culture within the family. Repetition had made it ordinary. The family had moved across several states over the years, carefully avoiding detection, always staying just ahead of suspicion. They relied on government welfare, which allowed them to remain isolated and self-sufficient without interacting with outside institutions. When neighbors grew too curious or concerned, they packed up and moved again. This dance of evasion lasted for decades, and no one, not teachers, not social workers, not medical staff, caught on. Until finally, the conditions became too severe to ignore. When the full investigation launched in 2012, the Children's Court of New South Wales took the extraordinary step of making the case public, albeit using pseudonyms. The scale and scope of what had happened was deemed unique in the world. Forensic psychologists, child protection officers, and doctors worked tirelessly to rehabilitate the children. Many had to be taught how to hold a spoon, how to bathe, how to recognize basic emotions, how to distinguish a sibling from a parent. Simple concepts like privacy, school, or the idea that babies don't come from brothers were completely foreign. The damage was not just physical or intellectual. It was spiritual. These were lives stunted from birth, childhoods shattered before they even began. The court ruled that none of the children could ever be returned to their biological families. Most were placed in permanent state care, with carefully monitored therapy and specialized schooling. Some of them, despite progress, would likely never be able to live independently. And what of the adults? 13 members of the cult family were eventually charged with various crimes. A few served short sentences, none longer than 5 years. Critics called it a failure of justice. Others pointed out that the damage had already been done. The system had missed its window to intervene, and the consequences were irreversible. To this day, the full story remains partially sealed by court orders. Many of the children's names have been changed. Some will never know their full genetic history. Others, mercifully, may never understand the full horror of what they were born into. And the property itself? Abandoned now. The wind moves through the empty caravans. The tents sag in the sun. Kangaroo tracks dot the soil where children once played in squalor. But the silence isn't peaceful. It's the silence of a secret finally uncovered. The cult clan reminds us that horror doesn't always come with bloodshed or monsters. Sometimes, it's hidden in plain sight, in the normalcy of repeated abuse, in the routine of neglect, in the long shadow cast by isolation and denial. And yet, there's a strange echo here. Just like the Whitakers, the cult children were not monsters. They were born into a world they didn't choose, a structure they didn't build, and they endured it with a kind of quiet resilience that defies understanding. So as we leave the Scrublands behind and turn toward our next chapter, let this moment linger. Not all horror is loud. Sometimes it whispers through generations. There's a phrase that appears again and again in the court documents related to the cult case: generational trauma. It's often used to describe the psychological weight passed down within families after war, famine, or catastrophe. But in the cult family's case, that trauma didn't come from external forces. It was homegrown, passed not only through stories or behaviors, but through DNA, forged in silence, and reinforced by a complete absence of outside accountability. To understand how such a family could exist for so long without intervention, one must consider the very landscape of rural Australia. Australia is a land of extremes: immense deserts, lush rainforests, endless plains. While its cities gleam with modernity, large swaths of the interior remain remote, disconnected, and chronically underserved. In these places, small communities, sometimes a single family, can live for decades with little oversight. And when those families actively avoid contact, as the cults did, the chances of detection fall to near zero. The cult family had a deliberate system in place to remain invisible. They withdrew their children from any formal schooling. They moved frequently across states: New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, never settling for long. Whenever neighbors grew suspicious, they packed up and vanished into the landscape. Their children never had birth certificates, never saw doctors, never visited hospitals unless in emergency, and even then, fake names were sometimes used. They weren't just poor, they were off-grid in every sense of the word. The only reason they were discovered at all was due to a low-level welfare complaint. A report flagged the children's failure to attend school. Nothing serious at first glance, something that happens often in rural, underfunded regions. But when a caseworker finally arrived on the property in 2012, she found something far beyond truancy. The initial visit led to a second, then a third, then a full investigation. The more officials uncovered, the more the family's entire internal logic unraveled. Children were found sleeping with animals, including dogs and kangaroos. Some had no understanding of personal hygiene. Others had infections left untreated for years. Multiple children had severe hearing or vision impairments, left unaddressed. One investigator noted a child who had never brushed her teeth in her entire life. She had no idea what a toothbrush was for. Another child, a boy around 10 years old, had no concept of age. When asked how old he was, he responded, "Blue." But perhaps the most haunting moment occurred when one child, a girl of only 12, was asked who her father was. She hesitated, then pointed to 3 different adult males. "All of them," she said. That confusion wasn't her fault. It was a symptom of a family where incest was normalized to the point of erasing lineage. Children did not understand boundaries. Siblings were also cousins, sometimes nieces or uncles. Fathers were also grandfathers. In some cases, no one knew for sure. The state responded quickly, at least by bureaucratic standards. 12 children were removed immediately and placed in emergency care. Each underwent genetic testing, psychological evaluation, and developmental assessment. The results were devastating. One doctor described the group as exhibiting a level of genetic impairment unparalleled in modern clinical history. The family's bloodline had folded inward so many times that even the healthiest-looking children carried latent abnormalities. The risk of further reproduction among them was incalculable. The adults, meanwhile, remained largely indifferent to the removal of their children. Some protested, others simply shrugged. Several of them could not comprehend why police were involved. In their eyes, they had done nothing wrong. And that was perhaps the most chilling realization of all. This wasn't abuse hidden in shadows, masked by guilt. It was structural, woven into every aspect of life within the clan. Fathers had taught their sons that sexual access to sisters was a right. Mothers had told their daughters to accept advances from uncles and cousins. The older children passed down the same knowledge to the younger ones. It was a closed ecosystem morally and genetically, and no one had ever broken the cycle. Until now. Following the state's intervention, a massive, coordinated effort was launched to provide psychosocial rehabilitation for the affected children. Special educators were brought in. Therapists, doctors, social workers. Each child had to be taught from scratch how to speak clearly, how to wash, how to trust. Progress was slow. Some children, especially the older ones, never fully recovered their ability to function independently. Others, especially those removed at a younger age, made remarkable strides, learning to read, learning basic emotional boundaries, forming attachments to their foster families. But even for those who improved, the scars were permanent. Many bore lifelong developmental delays, emotional disorders, and health complications stemming from inherited conditions. As for the legal response, the criminal prosecutions were complex. Some family members denied the incest outright, claiming the children were lying. Others offered bizarre justifications, including one man who said, "God made us all from the same people anyway." Ultimately, more than a dozen adults were convicted of various charges, ranging from child abuse and sexual assault to neglect and welfare fraud. But the sentences were brief, ranging from 1 to 5 years. No one was imprisoned for longer than that. The public outcry was loud. Many demanded a full inquiry into how the family had avoided detection for so long. Others questioned why such short sentences were handed down for crimes so generational and devastating. The government, under pressure, launched an internal review. Reports surfaced of missed warning signs, school records that were never followed up on, welfare reports that were closed prematurely, and field workers who lacked the authority to escalate suspicions. In truth, the cult family had slipped through the cracks of multiple systems: education, health, child protection, all of which were designed to function within society, not outside of it. And the cults had lived outside of society for over 40 years. After the dust settled, most of the children disappeared from public view. Their names changed, their identities sealed. And rightly so. They didn't need more headlines. They didn't need judgment. What they needed, what they still need, is the kind of safety and routine most of us take for granted. A bed with clean sheets, a light that turns on, a kitchen with food, a room where no one touches them without consent. The cult clan will be remembered for what they represent. A worst-case scenario, a breakdown of societal contact so complete that families forget how to be families. A warning of what happens when silence is inherited, and when institutions fail to reach the unreachable. But if there's a thin thread of light in this story, it lies in the children. Their resilience, their capacity to learn, to trust, to hope. They weren't cursed. They weren't evil. They were born into a map without exits. And now, at least, the doors have opened, even if slowly. As we leave the cracked soil of Baroa behind and drift back into the quiet dark of our own rooms, take a moment to consider how many other stories like this remain untold. Not just in Australia, but across the world. Not all monsters hide in woods. Some live in tents. Some live in family photos. Some are not monsters at all, just victims of a pattern too old to remember starting. In the next chapter, we journey north to Canada, where a family on South Mountain built their own kingdom of silence. One that lasted over a century. But for now, rest your thoughts. Let the wind settle. Let the memory of those children soften into stillness. And let's continue gently. The Goler clan of Nova Scotia. Far to the north, beyond the reach of the Appalachian Mountains, across the border and into the woods of Nova Scotia, another story unfolded. One quieter, older, and perhaps even more forgotten. Here, in the heavy green of South Mountain, tucked between moss-covered rocks and weather-beaten cabins, the Goler clan lived for over a century in almost total isolation. They were not royalty, not cultists, not criminals in the traditional sense. For a long time, they were simply poor, forgotten, unseen. But in time, their story would come to symbolize something far darker. What happens when poverty meets silence, and silence turns into generational harm? The Goler family, sometimes spelled Golar or Goler in early records, settled in Nova Scotia's Annapolis Valley sometime in the 1800s. The land was rocky, the winters long, and work scarce. Over time, a pattern emerged. Families huddled together in tiny wooden homes, chopping firewood, foraging, and scraping by on whatever seasonal labor they could find. But unlike nearby villages, the Goler clan began to drift inward. Neighbors moved away, new families didn't arrive, and slowly, over decades, the world outside forgot them. Roads grew over, trails washed out. What was once a poor community became a closed loop, both geographically and genetically. By the 20th century, the Goler family had transformed into an interconnected web of cousins, siblings, uncles, aunts, and children. Many shared the same last name. Many didn't know who their real fathers were. And still, no one came. At first glance, the Goler homesteads looked like any other struggling rural settlement. Small, drafty cabins built from hand-cut logs, outhouses out back, chickens roaming freely. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp moss, and earth. The sound of a hammer or handsaw could be heard in the distance, or the yelping of dogs chasing after squirrels. But something else lingered here, too. Something unspoken. The first signs that something was wrong came not from within the family, but from teachers and social workers in the nearby towns. Some of the Goler children, those whose parents bothered to send them to school, showed up dirty, bruised, malnourished, and withdrawn. Some couldn't read. Some flinched when touched. Some were openly aggressive. When questioned, a few children muttered phrases that made little sense at the time. "Uncle sleeps in my bed. My sister's baby is my dad's. We don't talk when the candles are out." In 1980, one of the youngest girls, only 14 years old, mustered the courage to speak clearly to someone she trusted. Her disclosure opened the door. The resulting investigation peeled back a truth so disturbing that entire legal protocols had to be rewritten. Over the next 4 years, investigators pieced together a picture of the Goler family that was almost too tragic to believe. Dozens of children had been born into households where incest was not just present, it was routine. Brothers slept with sisters. Fathers impregnated daughters. Uncles preyed on nieces, and no one stopped it. In fact, many of the adults didn't view it as wrong. Interviews with the family revealed a chilling pattern. When asked why they had abused a child, several adults claimed, "That's how I was raised." Some believed the girls were willing. Others insisted it was just what families do when they're close. They weren't being sarcastic. They were speaking from a place of total moral erosion, passed down like a family recipe, until consent, privacy, and autonomy were erased. The physical conditions of the homes reflected this breakdown. Most cabins had no plumbing, no electricity, no sanitation. Children slept on bare mattresses, sometimes with siblings, sometimes with older relatives. Food was scarce. Clean water was rare. In one particularly horrifying case, a child was found sleeping in the same bed as the family's dogs, covered in fleas, his skin raw from scratching. One boy, Cecil Goler, was paralyzed from the neck down and could not speak. Investigators at first assumed it was a birth injury, but as they spent time observing him, they noticed something unusual. He would often bark softly or groan at the door when someone approached. A behavioral expert concluded, heartbreakingly, that Cecil had likely learned these sounds from the family dog, having grown up without sufficient human contact or stimulation. Other children displayed signs of intellectual disability, emotional trauma, and severe developmental delay. And yet, despite all of this, no one had intervened for decades. When the case finally went to trial, 13 adult members of the Goler clan were charged with crimes ranging from incest and sexual assault to neglect and corruption of minors. The courtroom was packed. Journalists from across Canada watched as a previously unknown family was held up as the darkest possible mirror of rural poverty and government failure. The sentences were surprisingly short. The longest was 7 years. Most served less than 5. But the damage to the children, the real victims, was far deeper. In total, over 100 children were investigated as potential victims or participants in the cycle of abuse. Many were removed from their homes and placed in state care. Some were eventually adopted. Others remained in the system into adulthood. A few ran away. One of them, Donna Goler, would later become an activist, advocating for better child protection laws in rural Canada. She had been only 11 when she testified. Her words helped put her uncles and father behind bars. Her bravery became one of the few bright lights in an otherwise harrowing case. But not every child made it out whole. Some never learned to read or write. Some never fully understood what had been done to them. Some continued the pattern, having children in their teens, living on the edge of society, always looking over their shoulder. And still, even after all this, many Canadians forgot. The story faded from the headlines. The trial ended. The cabins decayed. And South Mountain grew quiet again. Today, little remains of the original Goler homesteads. Trees have reclaimed many of the paths. The cabins collapsed. Only moss-covered stone chimneys remain in some places, pointing skyward like gravestones. But the lessons remain, painfully so. The Goler case forced Canada to reckon with the invisibility of rural poverty. It exposed how shame and silence, when left unchallenged, can fester into generational damage. It challenged the myth that these things can't happen here. Because they did, and the echoes are still felt. In the years since, changes have been made. Rural social services were expanded. Training for abuse detection was improved. School systems were encouraged to report neglect more aggressively. But no amount of reform can undo the scars left on those children. Their story serves as both a warning and a memorial. It is not only a story about inbreeding. It is a story about failure of families to protect, of communities to intervene, of institutions to reach beyond the cities and into the shadows of the woods. And yet, even here, in the coldest corners of the story, there are glimmers of survival. A sister holding her brother's hand in court. A young woman writing her first sentence. A boy, once silent, laughing for the first time in foster care. These are fragile victories, but they matter because they remind us that cycles can be broken. The Goler children never asked to be born into that mountain. They never asked to carry the weight of a family's history. But some of them, against all odds, learned to set it down. As you let your breath slow and the fire in your mind's hearth dim to quiet coals, remember the paths that wound through South Mountain, the thick trees, the creaking floorboards, the quiet shame that no one spoke of for years. And then remember the moment one girl finally did speak. And everything changed. The story of the Goler clan, like so many others hidden in the folds of quiet landscapes, challenges what we assume about the past, and more disturbingly, what we allow in the present. After the arrests, the investigations, and the court headlines faded, Nova Scotia found itself reckoning with more than just a single family. It was forced to ask, how many more South Mountains exist across this country? And what systems were never built to reach them? In many ways, the Goler story was a product of Canada's quiet forgetting. The rural poor, especially in the 20th century, lived on the edge of national consciousness. Politicians spoke often of cities, of trade, of global economies. But fewer words were spared for families without roads, without doctors, without clean water. The Golers became symbols, but not by choice. For the journalists who covered the story, it was difficult to even gain access to the homes. Many of the paths weren't marked on maps. Some homes had no addresses. Others were reached only by hiking through dense woods, often with the help of local guides who had grown up in the area. Inside, the smell was overwhelming: mold, rot, unwashed bedding, the heavy odor of damp timber and trapped air. Many of the homes were makeshift, built by hand with salvaged boards and corrugated iron, leaning slightly from the pull of years. In one home, a social worker found a mattress shared by 5 children, all of them under 12. The only window was covered in black plastic. No books, no toys. The only light came from a cracked kerosene lantern on the floor. When asked about school, one child reportedly replied, "We don't go there. We don't need it." Not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know what it was for. Their days were filled with routine survival, gathering firewood, looking after siblings, and avoiding adults in the home who might demand more than chores. One of the key psychological insights to emerge from the case came from a forensic psychiatrist who had interviewed both the children and several adults involved. His conclusion was chilling. The cycle wasn't just allowed to exist, it was invisible to those within it. This wasn't sadism. This wasn't evil in the way that books describe. It was a total collapse of knowledge and empathy, like a language lost over generations. The Goler adults didn't talk about right and wrong because they no longer recognized those lines. They had grown up being abused, and in their minds, they were simply doing what had been done to them. What truly horrified investigators wasn't the brutality, it was the normality. There were no locked basements, no elaborate cover-ups. The abuse happened in plain daylight, in beds beside wood stoves, on floors covered in rags. And that's what made it harder to see. Unlike urban cases of child exploitation, which are often uncovered through networks or online behavior, this was a rural crime of omission. A slow generational decay, untreated, unacknowledged, and unrecorded. What little support the Golers received came through welfare checks. Small monthly deposits that kept food on the table but required no in-person inspection. No one followed up on the children. No one tested literacy. No one, it seems, asked questions for decades. And yet, even in this grim picture, there were moments of light. One social worker recalled a visit to a foster home months after the rescue. A young girl, previously nonverbal, had begun humming songs she'd heard on the radio. Another child had learned to ride a bicycle. A third, just 6 years old, wrote her name in wobbly crayon letters and taped it to her bedroom door. These small triumphs may seem insignificant, but for children raised in silence, each word, each step, each laugh is a revolution. The broader legacy of the Goler case is a complicated one. On the one hand, it spurred reforms in child welfare, particularly in rural provinces. Funding was redirected. New training modules were developed. Interagency cooperation was strengthened. On the other hand, many families in the region felt branded, as if poverty itself had become suspicious. Some resented the media attention. Others withdrew even further into isolation. The shame was not limited to those found guilty. It bled into the soil. There were those who defended the Golers, too, not the abuse but the people. They were uneducated. One former neighbor said in an interview, "They didn't know any better. They weren't evil, just lost." And perhaps that's what lingers most after the dust settles. What happens to people when they are forgotten long enough? What replaces education, guidance, love, when none of it is ever offered? In the Goler homes, the answer was tragic. Superstition, routine, and repetition. Without intervention, one generation simply copies the last, not out of malice, but out of absence. The story isn't easy to tell, or to hear, but it is necessary, because it reminds us that monsters are rarely born. They are often shaped, generation by generation, by what is missing. And yet, Again, we find the thread of resilience. One girl's voice, one social worker who listened, one prosecutor who refused to look away. And from that small crack in the wall, light got in. As of today, some of the Goler children, now adults, live under new names. Some are parents, some are artists, some prefer anonymity, and that too is a kind of healing. The trees on South Mountain still sway in the wind. The snow still falls in winter. Time moves quietly there, as it always has. But now, those who live nearby know the signs. They remember the silence, and they carry, perhaps, a deeper vigilance. Because when no one listens for too long, the cost is not measured in dollars or headlines. It's measured in lives that never learned the words to ask for help. Let us return for a moment to the night the first child testified in court. The room was silent. Grown men, her uncles, her father, sat just feet away. The girl, no more than 11, stepped up to the microphone. And she spoke, clear, direct, without trembling. He touched me where he shouldn't. I told him to stop. He didn't. That was the moment the case cracked open. That was the moment a child ended what generations had refused to. And that is the moment worth remembering, not for the horror that preceded it, but for the courage it took to end it. Now, we leave Nova Scotia behind. The cold gives way again to warmth. The trees blur, and the cabins sink into the fog of memory. But this time we carry something with us, an awareness that the past is not as far away as we like to think. That silence, left unchecked, grows roots, and that the faintest voice, raised in truth, can break even the oldest of chains. The WWII scenario, if 98% of people die. Let's shift now, not just across borders but across timelines. Because while the previous chapters took us into the past, tonight we also wander into the plausible future. Into a quiet, scorched world that may never come, and yet still hangs just above us, like a blade we refuse to see. Imagine this: World War III breaks out, and by the time the fires stop, 98% of the global population is gone. Not displaced, not wounded, gone. What happens to the species that remains? Not politically, not militarily, but genetically, socially, spiritually. What does the world look like when the survivors must start again? Not from scratch, but from ruins. Let's begin, as always, in silence. It is the year 2087. The planet has been burned and battered by a series of nuclear exchanges, biological warfare, and environmental collapse. Most major cities are craters. The internet has long since flickered out. Global communication exists only in fragments, passed by radio towers powered by scavenged solar panels. The skies are no longer clear. Dust hangs in the atmosphere. The oceans have swallowed coastlines. Only a few fertile pockets remain. In these places, valleys, mountain shelters, underground bunkers, humanity clings to itself. Roughly 150 million survivors, scattered across the globe. Fewer people than the Roman Empire once held. Fewer than live in modern Bangladesh. And with no central government, no working science labs, no real medicine, the old rules no longer apply. Humanity becomes tribal again. Local, suspicious, guarded. Some communities wall themselves off completely, terrified of contamination, both biological and ideological. Others attempt to trade, to reconnect, to rebuild. But the most important element, the one no one talks about, is blood. Who marries whom? Who has children? And what happens when the world shrinks to such a degree that gene pools overlap in dangerous ways? Let's walk through a hypothetical village, one of hundreds dotting the new world. It's nestled in what was once southern Germany. There's a clean spring nearby, a small grove of trees that survived the fallout, and a few greenhouses powered by salvaged equipment. Maybe 300 people live here. They know each other. They eat together. They mourn together. And they marry each other. In the first generation, this feels fine. Everyone is healthy enough. The children grow up strong, if thin. There's no shortage of labor. People farm, gather, hunt. But by the second generation, cracks begin to show. Two cousins fall in love. A child is born with twisted feet. Another struggles to speak past age 5. A boy's eyes refuse to align. A girl grows a tumor behind her jaw. And because there is no advanced medical infrastructure, no genetic counseling, no access to outsiders, the solution is not found. Instead, it is normalized. The elders tell stories of the blue ones who lived in the hills. They say, "These things happen when God cleans the earth." Others speak of purity, of the survivors being chosen, and how their bloodlines must be preserved, even if that means marrying within. By the third generation, perhaps 60 years after the war, the consequences become unmistakable. Inbreeding depression, the scientific term, sets in with full force. You see, lower birth rates, higher infant mortality, slower mental development, a rise in congenital deformities, cleft palates, fused digits, spinal irregularities, and still the village does what it must. It continues. They cannot leave, radiation zones still linger across vast stretches of land, and travel is dangerous. They cannot find outsiders. Other villages may not even exist nearby. Or if they do, they may be hostile. And so they turn inward. The human species begins to resemble a series of genetic islands. Some are lucky, founded by more diverse survivors. Others are not. Eventually, some villages collapse as the birth defects outpace viable population growth. Others turn to rituals and myths, blaming the deformities on sin, or curses, or old world mistakes. Let's now imagine another region, perhaps in what was once rural Canada. A small survivor town of 200 people. For the first decade, they ration medication. Antibiotics, vaccines, painkillers, all limited. A single flu outbreak kills 12. Then comes the second decade. Children are born slower. Some don't speak. Others walk on their toes. There's no schooling anymore, only what elders can recall. They draw letters in the dirt. They teach basic numbers. But as literacy disappears, so too does knowledge. By the fourth decade, a child is born with no eyelids. Another is born deaf. And one, the village whispers, is born with webbed fingers and a heart too large. But the real horror is that no one is shocked anymore. Because this is what life is now. And the science behind it is cruel but clear. In a population bottleneck where a massive portion of humanity is wiped out, genetic diversity plummets. With fewer individuals comes less variance in genetic material. Recessive genes, which are usually harmless if inherited from one parent, now have far higher odds of meeting a matching pair. These include genes that cause developmental delays, genes that cause metabolic disorders, genes that affect brain structure, immune strength, and even behavior. In a large, connected world, such issues are rare, buffered by diversity. But in a post-war world with only 2% of humanity remaining, the odds become merciless. Even worse, in many regions, cultural taboos begin to erode. Where once incest was condemned, it now becomes a practical necessity, justified by survival, by continuity, by tradition. And so, the future begins to mirror the past. Not the shining cities or the global councils, but the mountain shacks, the grunting children, the blue-skinned villagers, the tangled bloodlines of secrecy and shame. It's important to say here that inbreeding alone is not a moral failure. The problem arises when it becomes a pattern, driven not by ignorance, but by circumstance. If 98% of people vanish, we are left with two realities: a genetic puzzle with missing pieces, a social map torn beyond recognition. Some communities may fight against this fate. They may send out scouts, build radio towers, attempt to reconnect, exchange members to diversify their gene pool. These pockets may survive, may even thrive. But others, cut off, rigid, superstitious, will fall into patterns long warned about. And just like the Fugates, just like the Whitakers, just like the Colts and the Golers, they will become stories, told in hushed tones, documented in journals if any survive. The difference is, this time, it won't be a tragedy of the past. It will be the origin story of what comes next. In such a future, our great-grandchildren may not know the word inbreeding. They may not speak of DNA, or alleles, or chromosomes. They'll have stories of blood that folds in on itself, of eyes that see different, of minds that forget too early, And in 1,000 years, if humanity lasts that long, they'll dig up the ruins of our world and wonder how we lived with so many people and then left the survivors so few. This chapter is not about fear. It's about vigilance. Because when systems fall apart, when empires burn and cities turn to ash, the work of survival becomes simple. But the work of remembering who we are, that is harder. It requires us to teach, to connect, to reach beyond the fence, and to resist always the quiet gravity of isolation. Because no matter how advanced we become, we are never far from our most primitive selves. And sometimes all it takes is a war to remind us. Let's continue in the silence. The kind that would follow after the bombs, the sirens, the last transmissions. The kind that blankets a world emptied not by design, but by escalation, by accident, by human hands reaching too far for power. In this new world, the survivors do not speak much of the war. Not because they have forgotten, but because they don't know what was lost or even how to name it. They've inherited a landscape of bones, books with missing pages, machines they can't repair, and more dangerously, ideas without context. Old myths, pieces of science, fragments of memory. This is where the true danger begins. In one survivor enclave, perhaps in the former Midwest of the US, a new belief emerges. That purity is safety. That the bloodlines which survived were chosen. Intermixing with outsiders is viewed as contamination. Marriage outside the group is forbidden. Another community in what used to be Central Asia rewrites its history entirely. They teach that the old world died because it lost its traditions, allowed outsiders in, let love cross too many lines. And so, in the name of safety, they begin to arrange unions. Siblings with cousins, uncles with nieces, all to preserve what they now call the clean line. Of course, science, real science, would tell them this is dangerous, that such bottlenecks compress mutation, allow bad genes to surface, deformities to multiply. But science, in this broken world, is often whispers around a fire. There are no labs, no warnings, only rituals. Within 3 generations, the effects begin to show. Infant mortality spikes. Children are born unable to walk. Others cannot learn beyond the age of 5. By the 4th generation, entire families begin to collapse, not from war or weather, but from within. This is post-collapse inbreeding. A slow, quiet collapse of genetic diversity accelerated by isolation, fear, and myth. But here's the subtlety. Not every community falls into this trap. Some miraculously resist. In the old mountains of Japan, a group of survivors rebuilds a council not based on power but on memory. They assign runners to travel, to seek new blood, to build alliances between distant groups. Trade routes form. Marriages are arranged not by proximity, but by genetic distance. Their children thrive. They grow strong, tall, quick-witted. A woman born in their 3rd generation begins to rebuild botany. She remembers vaguely from her grandmother's stories how plants pass traits. She begins cataloging them, mapping seeds, cross-pollinating. She realizes what's happening to other villages. She writes a warning. The blue faces come not from evil, but from forgetting. We must marry across water, across valley, across breath. It's a crude sentence, but it survives. Years later, it will be carved into a stone and placed at the center of a market that grows from their village. People pass beneath it, a reminder, a code. Meanwhile, other settlements, hundreds of miles away, tighten their circles. They keep their secrets. They marry their own. And as the generations pile up, the signs of inbreeding depression become undeniable. Children with enlarged skulls, sunken eye sockets, cleft palates, clubbed limbs, impaired immune systems. Their learning slows, language fades. They revert to gestures, hums, growls. It is not myth, it is neurodegeneration inherited over time. And yet, to them, it is simply how the world is now. One survivor community begins to believe that children who don't speak are blessed, touched by ancestors. They become shamans, oracles, not because they show insight, but because they are different, quiet, still. Another believes that deformities are signs of spiritual punishment. Those born with misaligned faces are left at the forest edge. A return to older, darker rituals. Without the guardrails of science and shared knowledge, pattern becomes truth, belief becomes law, and biology becomes fate. In a world where 98% of people have died, and survivors are scattered and terrified, it is inevitable that many groups will slide into this fate. The most tragic part? They will never know the names of the things that are killing them. They will not say mutated recessive genes. They will not say unbuffered homozygosity. They will say, the gods are displeased, or the river spirits want to trade, and their children will grow up beneath these banners, never questioning them. Until one day, centuries later, another resurgence begins. A group of travelers from far-off settlements, more successful, more connected, stumble upon these inward-facing villages. They carry maps, solar kits, translated books, and what they find stuns them. The survivors are alive, yes, but in body only. The people in these closed-off communities have no memory of their own past. Their speech is broken. Their writing is gone. Their traditions, built on the rot of fear, tell them that strangers bring disease. Some are hostile. Some hide. A few try to communicate, grunting like children, pointing to scars on their own skin. They do not recognize other humans as kin. The new travelers do not know what to do. They cannot force contact, doing so risks violence or disease spread. They cannot wait, the mutations continue. And so, the decision is made. These communities must be documented. Not saved. Not changed. Just remembered. Their names are recorded, if they have them. Their habits, their genetic traits, their bloodlines. It's the same instinct that led Dr. Madison Caywin into the hills of Kentucky to find the blue-skinned Fugates. The same curiosity, the same grief. Eventually, these villages are labeled genetic echo groups. And just like the Golers, the Whitakers, and the Colts, their legacy becomes a warning etched into digital memory. A reminder of what happens when the world shrinks too fast. The gene pool collapses. The silence becomes law. In time, the new world builds again. Slowly, carefully, technology returns. Not with fireworks, but with patient repair. Libraries are reassembled. Code is rewritten. DNA is studied again. And the story of the post-WWII survivors becomes part of that archive. They are not monsters. They are our descendants. They are the price paid by the generations who pressed buttons in bunkers, who built bombs with no exit strategy. And their faces, some still blue, some still silent, will haunt the history books of the rebuilt world, not as villains, but as the final, unspoken proof that humanity cannot survive on isolation alone. It needs difference. It needs connection. It needs outreach, diversity, and shared memory to continue. Because without it, even the strongest survivors fold in on themselves. Not in fire, but in slow, forgotten blood. Why it happens, the science, history, and repetition of inbreeding. Let's take a step back now. Not into a place, but into a pattern. Because as you've likely begun to notice, these stories, spanning centuries, continents, and classes, share something deeper than tragedy. They echo each other. And at the center of every echo is a simple, stubborn truth. Inbreeding happens. Not because people are broken, but because systems are. To understand why it happens, we need to begin with biology. Every human carries 2 copies of every gene, one from each parent. Most of these genes work quietly without issue. But sometimes a person carries a recessive mutation, a tiny error that doesn't cause problems on its own, because the other copy functions normally. But if 2 people with the same recessive mutation have a child, the child has a 25% chance of inheriting 2 broken copies, and that's when the trouble begins. This is how recessive disorders emerge. And the more closely related 2 parents are, the more likely they share the same rare mutations. In small, closed-off populations, where people marry within families out of necessity, tradition, or fear, this risk compounds generation after generation. And that's when we begin to see the patterns. Cognitive delays, physical malformations, immunodeficiency, stillbirths, shortened lifespans, Science calls this inbreeding depression, the gradual accumulation of harmful genetic traits when diversity is reduced. But biology is only one side of the story. The other half is social. Because throughout history, the most powerful motivators of inbreeding have not been genetics. They've been culture, class, geography, and control. Let's begin with the royals. In ancient Egypt, the pharaohs married their sisters. Not secretly, but proudly. It was considered divine. The gods had done it, so why shouldn't the rulers? King Tutankhamun, the famous boy king, was the product of a full sibling union. Modern scans of his remains show signs of genetic disease, a cleft palate, and a clubbed foot. He died young. Then there were the Habsburgs, Europe's most famous example of royal inbreeding. For centuries, they married cousins and nieces to keep land, wealth, and power in the family. The result? By the 1700s, they had developed what geneticists call a pedigree collapse. A situation where someone's family tree folds in on itself so tightly that one ancestor appears dozens of times. The last male heir of the Spanish Habsburg line, Charles II, was born with a jaw so misshapen he couldn't chew food properly. He suffered frequent seizures, never learned to speak clearly, and died without issue. His genetic coefficient of inbreeding was roughly 0.25, the equivalent of a child born to a parent and sibling. But while royal inbreeding was motivated by power, many of the cases we've seen tonight were driven by something else. Isolation. Geographic isolation, like in the hills of Kentucky, cultural isolation, like in the Colt clan, and economic isolation, like in Nova Scotia. In remote communities, people don't always choose inbreeding. Sometimes it's simply the only option that seems safe. The roads are bad. Outsiders are mistrusted. The government doesn't visit. And even if they do, what happens next? Who pays to move? Who leaves their land behind? So families stay. And over time, the genetic drawbridge rises without anyone realizing. Then there's the role of ideology. In some insular religious communities, marrying within is encouraged, if not enforced. Sometimes it's about faith, sometimes about lineage, sometimes about tradition, and sometimes about control. The fewer the choices, the more predictable the behavior. The more predictable the behavior, the easier it is to manage. And so the walls are built. From the inside, these communities aren't always hidden in forests. Some live in plain sight. Cities have their own enclaves, families that have intermarried for decades, bound by shared belief, language, or shame. They may never speak of it, but the outcomes are the same. And when secrecy becomes routine, it's not long before abuse follows. Because that's another truth hiding in this chapter. Inbreeding often walks hand in hand with silence. When family becomes law, and the outside world is cast as enemy, there is no one to call, no one to tell, and sometimes no words to explain what's been done. That's why so many of the children we've heard about, Fugates, Whitakers, Golers, struggled to speak. Not just from neurological issues, but because no one taught them how. No one told them they could. Speech requires exposure, connection, safety, and in the deepest pockets of generational inbreeding, these things vanish. There is also the matter of accumulated trauma. Because when you grow up in an environment of repeated abuse and neglect, your brain adapts. Neural pathways change. Language centers atrophy. Memory becomes slippery. You learn not to remember. You learn not to question. You learn not to think too far ahead. In that state, silence becomes survival. And so, the cycle continues. A child born of incest, raised in a house of secrecy, grows into an adult who sees no other way. But of course, not all inbreeding stories end in collapse. There are exceptions. In Iceland, for example, the population has remained relatively small and isolated for centuries. But through careful record-keeping, community vigilance, and modern genetic tools, they've largely avoided the pitfalls of inbreeding. The key difference? Transparency, awareness, education. The Icelandic people know their history. They track it. They talk about it. Whereas in places like Troublesome Creek or the wooded hills of Nova Scotia, the past is something you don't bring up. And that's where the real danger lives, not in the genes, but in the refusal to speak. Because when a community stops telling its own story, the body begins to do it for them. In twisted limbs, in unspoken words, in eyes that don't meet yours. It's also worth noting that modern technology, when used ethically, can help break these patterns. Genetic testing is more accessible than ever. Education can travel farther than roads. And stories, like the ones we've shared tonight, can reach those once thought unreachable. But the first step is always the same: recognizing the pattern. Inbreeding, in all its forms, is not a relic of the past. It is a mirror, and it shows us what happens when people are cut off from resources, from help, from each other. It reminds us that bloodlines, when left unchallenged, do not protect us. They close in, they repeat, they weaken, and if we're not careful, they tell a story not of pride or heritage, but of forgetting. So now, as the firelight dims and the world around you softens into sleep, carry this reflection. The next time someone speaks of keeping it in the family, or of purity, or of heritage that must not mix, ask yourself what lies beneath that phrase. Because sometimes it's a memory of fear, and sometimes it's the beginning of a silence we've heard far too many times before. Final thoughts, cycles that refuse to die. The fire is low now, just embers. You might hear them in your mind. Faint crackles in a hearth that no longer warms a body but gently rocks a memory. This is the part of the night where stories stop being stories, where they turn into something softer, maybe a lesson, maybe a sigh. Because for all we've wandered tonight, through kingdoms, hillsides, war-scarred soil, and underground bunkers, the heart of the story never moved. It stayed where it always was, in a room, a family, a village, where no one came in, and no one got out. Inbreeding is not just a biological occurrence. It is a human ritual, one that appears again and again wherever the world narrows, wherever fear wins, wherever the walls get too high. We have seen it draped in gold, worn by kings. We have seen it hidden in shame, buried in cabins. We have seen it justified by myth, preserved by poverty, excused by ignorance. And in every case, it told us the same thing, that when people stop reaching outward, when they protect bloodlines instead of people, the body suffers, but the soul suffers too. Let's return for a moment, briefly, to Troublesome Creek, to the Fugates. They didn't ask for the world to notice them. They didn't know their skin would turn them into stories. They didn't ask to become the face of a genetic condition. But they survived. They built lives on soil most wouldn't bother to till. They raised children on land others would call unlivable. They shared what they had. They kept going. The blue skin, that wasn't shameful. It was just the signal, a whisper in the blood, a reminder that sometimes isolation doesn't punish with violence, punishes with stillness. A stillness where no new voices arrive, no new questions, no new ideas, only repetition, only return, only another child with the same eyes, the same walk, the same fate. And then there are those like the Colts whose story was harder, darker, where what began as isolation mutated into something monstrous. A place where incest was not just a pattern, but a culture. Where children grew up not knowing what the word normal even meant. Where language broke down. Where silence became a language. The tragedy there wasn't just genetic. It was spiritual, because they had been forgotten. By roads, by services, by systems, by people. Until one day, someone finally walked in with a notepad and a camera and realized, this isn't backwoods folklore. This is right now. This is what happens when no one checks in. When no one listens long enough to notice the cracks. And yet, here's the thing that lingers as the last log burns. These families, these people are not curiosities. They are not other. They are not myths to gawk at. They are always the end result of what happens when a world chooses walls over bridges. When it lets fear or class or convenience divide people into those worth connecting to, and those better left alone. We talk about cycles. Let's define them clearly. The cycle begins with poverty or power. Both can isolate in their own ways. One locks people out. The other locks people in. Then comes fear. Fear of outsiders, of corruption, of dilution, tells us to look inward, to stay close, to marry our own, to trust no one. Then comes silence. Because once you've circled the wagons, you stop sharing stories. You forget what your cousins were like 2 generations ago. You don't ask where your great-grandmother came from. You don't need to. Then comes repetition. The first cousin, the second cousin, the shared surname, the missing teeth, the children who don't speak. And then, if nothing interrupts it, collapse. Biological, cultural, historical. Collapse doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes it just looks like people forgetting what joy felt like, what music was, what it meant to hear a different accent and be curious instead of afraid. That's the true tragedy of these stories. Not the deformities, not the awkward family trees, not the blue skin. It's that so many of these people never got the chance to be anything else. They were born into the end of a story when what they needed was a new beginning. And still, somehow, they survived. That's what makes this more than horror, more than pathology. It's also a record of what endurance looks like without resources, what stubbornness looks like when wrapped in denim and dirt and quiet hands. It's easy to romanticize old ways, to say, back then people married who was nearby. It was simpler, but simplicity in this context is often a euphemism for lack of choice, for being told, this is your lot, don't ask for more. And when people aren't allowed to ask for more, the walls stay up. And so, here is a small challenge. After this story ends, when you blow out your candle or turn off your phone, or roll over to let sleep pull you under, think of your own family tree. Not just who's in it, but who isn't, who was never allowed in, who wasn't safe to marry, who wasn't our kind, who wasn't from the right town, who had the wrong skin, the wrong last name, the wrong language, the wrong faith. And then ask, what could have grown from those missing branches? Because that's what this has been about, hasn't it? Not just the strangeness of inbreeding, but the cost of isolation. What might have been if more bridges were built, if more outsiders became insiders, if more children were raised among difference, not echoes. That's what the science tells us. That's what the history tells us. That's what the faces tell us. Those distant eyes, those soft words, those twisted limbs passed down like heirlooms. They say, let someone in, before the silence becomes permanent. So now, as the fire dies and the wind settles and your pillow softens beneath you, we end not with horror, but with hope, because cycles don't just continue, they also break, not with shouting, not with explosions, but with a question, a visit, a story, with one person choosing to step outside the circle. And so we sleep, not because we've forgotten the horrors, but because at last we've understood them. And now maybe we can dream something else, something wide, something full of strangers, something more beautiful than a name passed down too many times. Good night, and thank you for listening.